Terrific, thank you. So again, welcome on behalf of the National Executive Committee of CAC. My name is Lori Ebbison. It's a privilege to again have our third of 3 Strategic Priority National Overview sessions. Today's session is about aging offenders. I'm just glad we're not talking about aging volunteers because I think that would be a totally different topic. But today's call will be recorded, so any of our CAC members who are not available to call in at this particular time will have an opportunity to hear the recording at a later time. So as you may recall, NEC developed a strategic plan back in May where we discussed advice from the Correctional Investigator of Canada, from CSC, from CAC in each of our regions, and we've identified 3 priorities that seem quite timely for CACs across the country to address: employment, mental health, and aging offenders. So for each of these priorities, we've been holding an overview session like today, so we can all learn more about the research on the topic at hand and then discuss related CSC policy and programming. Any follow-up action planning about opportunities for CAC to make a difference in these areas will occur back in each of your regions. So today we're focusing on aging offenders. We're very pleased to have 2 guests with us. Lynn Stewart, the Senior Research Manager of Interventions and Women Offenders from the Research Branch of CFC, as well as Lucy Poliquin, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, who is the Senior Nursing Advisor in Health Services with CFC. So we'll start today with the research overview, then we'll have some time for questions and comments. An update from Health Services will follow, also with time for questions. And then we will be able to circulate following this call the recording, so you will have an opportunity to review that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lynn Stewart from the Research Branch. Lynn.
Oh, thank you, Lori. And I'm hoping that the interference is not going to make it difficult for you to hear me. As I've mentioned before, I've been able to do 2 others of these research summaries, and on both occasions I've emphasized how great an initiative it is and how much we welcome the opportunity to convey our research and how glad we are that someone out there is interested. This presentation is briefer than the other 2. We haven't done as much research on aging offenders, but in it I'll briefly review in a fairly general manner all the research that we've done in the last few years. All of the research that I'm going to refer to is currently published, so it's available if you would like to look at it in more detail. And Laurie, I believe that you have distributed these publications.
Correct.
In addition to the one-pagers that are on the web, if you want to request the full research report, the people who are responsible for that are very good at distributing those reports as soon as they're requested. Okay, so research at CSC has been examining issues related to aging offender population since the 1990s, but for this research I'll focus more on more recent work from 2010 and later. The more recent examinations of the older offender populations conducted by the branch have focused on the size of the population, its characteristics, as well as more detailed examinations of the physical and mental health needs of older offenders. Note that for those of you in the community, which is largely all of you, I suppose, most of this work is on people in custody. And we've noted that the pattern will be for whatever percentage of the population we find that is aging in custody, that percentage will be larger once they actually get to the community, which makes sense. Clearly, they get older as they age through their sentence. First of all, I'll just define an older offender in our research as an offender who's over 50. Now, normally, many of us would not consider ourselves over 50 and older, but for this particular disadvantaged population, generally this is the standard that's used in the research, and for the following reasons. Few offenders in CSC are over 65, very few relative to the Canadian population. I'll talk about those percentages later. Second, offenders tend to have had very difficult lifestyles coupled with the stress of being in prison. And so the combination of their lifestyle, the circumstances that they live in, generally means that they age more rapidly. So a 50-year-old man serving time in an institution is comparable, allegedly, to a 6-year-old person who has not been incarcerated. Finally, others claim that many offenders who have not received during their life adequate health care over the course of their lives, and so this adds to their problems with aging. So for most of the research that I'm going to cite now, the age limit that we're looking at is age 50 and over. So there are 4 different categories of research that we've done. We've looked at the size and the growth and actually made some projections on the aging offender population. We have a general profile of the aging population, and more specifically, we have some research on age and the physical health of offenders and the mental health of offenders. So I'm going to start with the size and the growth of the aging offender population. So like the Canadian aging population, the offender population is also aging. And these, of course, are important factors to consider, given that they will need to be accommodated physically, and they will also need the provision of more health care. So in the last 10 years, the percentage of the population that's 50 and over has doubled. So when I talk about these numbers, remember that when I talk about percentages for those coming in, they may not be the same as percentages of those who are in custody, nor the same for those who are in the community. The offenders age at each of those steps in their sentence. So what we've found that from 2002 to 2012, with regard to older women, the population of women coming in on new warrants grew from 5% population to 10%. For men over 50, the population grew from 8% to 14%. Again, these are men and women coming in on new warrants of committal. A more recent study, however, just looked at offenders in custody, and we found, this was the 2014 study, we found that 24% of federal offenders in custody were over 50, but only 4% were over 65. And very few were very old, so very few were 80 or over of the men, only 27 out of the whole population, and none of the women were over 80. And in comparison, the recent census, Canadian census, has indicated that 15% of the Canadian population were over 65, so that compares to 4% of our population. We did some research where we made projections on the extent to which this aging population will continue to grow. And in fact, the projections are showing that it will grow, particularly among the non-Aboriginal male offenders. The women's population and the Aboriginal population tends to be younger. And even the projections will show that the percentage of offenders who will be 80 and over will remain very low in the next 5 years. What's the profile then of these aging offenders? We'll start with just their criminal risk and need profile, and then go into a little bit more detail. Overall, older men and women tend to be rated as having lower risk and lower needs than their younger counterpoints. But there's some evidence that this may be changing, and the profile of older men and older women is starting to look more consistently, more like those of the younger population. The research that was done in 2015 indicated that older women were rated as having lower overall needs, lower overall risk, higher reintegration potential, and lower needs in employment, associate, substance use, and attitudes compared to younger women. So that would suggest that they would also have much better outcomes on release. More recent research indicates that older women have demonstrated an increased reoffending versatility, so they are somewhat higher risk and higher need than they were previously. In comparing men and women, older women were much less likely than older men to be convicted of sex offenses, and were much more likely to be convicted of drug offenses. And compared to older men, older women had less, again, elevated levels of risk and need. Older men were more likely to be recidivists. That is, they had previous offense histories rather than being first-time offenders. Whereas, this is an interesting statistic, I believe, for older women, almost half had received their first sentence when they were 50. Another third were also serving their first sentences. The comparable statistic for older men is 28% of men received their first sentence when they were over 50. Just looking at the physical health then of older offenders, as I mentioned to you in the research that we had done previously, we have conducted a physical health survey on all incoming offenders. After we completed that survey, we looked at the differences between offenders over 50 and under 50. I guess it's not surprising to you that find out that the older offenders tend to have more physical health conditions than the younger offenders. And I'll specify which conditions those are. Almost half of the women, 50 and over, had cardiovascular health conditions, and a quarter reported having blood-borne virus conditions. A greater proportion of older women also had cardiovascular problems. 47% of older women had cardiovascular problems. Diabetes, 17%. And a BMI, a body mass index, indicating they were overweight or obese. 60% of older women were overweight or obese. The comparable statistics for younger women, only 15% had cardiovascular problems, only 4% had diabetes, and 52% still were considered overweight or obese among those under 50. Looking at men, 13% of newly admitted men were 50 or over in this research, and of those, 24% had high blood pressure, not surprising, higher rates than for younger men, and 12% had diabetes. Older men were more likely than older women to report having a head injury, whereas older women were more likely to report having diabetes and a blood-borne virus than older men. With regard to activities of daily living, and it's important to record these because these suggest the percentage of offenders who are going to need assistance with activities like dressing, feeding, bathing, etc. So we found that 12% of incoming women and 9% of incoming men required assistance with some aspect of daily living. Those numbers were small, so we didn't divide them by age. Okay, moving on then to the mental health of aging offenders. The prevalence rates of current anxiety disorders, personality disorders, substance abuse disorders are lower among men who are 55 or older than among younger men. So whereas the physical health of older men appears to be worse in general, the mental health appears to be somewhat better. There's also a slight evidence of a slight decline in mood disorders, and that is a finding that is part of the general literature as well. We haven't completed this research for women. It's ongoing. We'll be able to report on it shortly. Okay, so the take-home messages then. Although still a relatively small proportion of the population of offenders are older, this proportion is growing up to maybe a quarter of the population now of those who are in custody. Aboriginal offenders and women offenders are less likely to be among the over 50 group than non-Aboriginal men. And the projections are that the growth in the aging population will largely be in that group among non-Aboriginal men. Older men and older women tend to be rated as having lower risk and lower needs than their younger counterparts, although this profile appears to be changing somewhat over time, and older women and older men have increasingly riskier profiles. Finally, older offenders are more likely than their younger counterpoints to report having physical health conditions. However, this is not the case for their mental health. And in fact, age may be somewhat a protective factor when considering a mental health diagnosis. And that's it. That's the extent of our research on aging offenders, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have right now.
Thank you, Lynn. That's a wonderful overview of the current profile of the aging offenders. We'll open it up for questions. So if you have a question or comment, please identify yourself by name and the location of your CAC, and then pose your question or comment.
Hi, this is Hafizur Rahman from CSE at Collins Bay in Kingston.
Go ahead.
Yes?
Yeah, do you have breakdown of the aging population in terms of regions, like the Atlantic, Central, and that kind of thing?
A breakdown in terms of?
Regions, different regions of Canada?
Regions. I do have that information. I don't have it in this presentation, but we do have an idea of which regions have higher. Just give me a second. I might be able to bring that up, actually. Yeah. We have them all, not in terms of percentages, but in terms of numbers in 2014. Did you want to hear what the numbers were for Ontario region?
Yes.
Okay, now these are numbers, not percentages. There were 918 in the Ontario region over 50 in 2014. And the comparable number in Quebec is 1,110. So somewhat higher in Quebec. Quebec had the highest numbers. Atlantic region, I guess it's not surprising, as the smallest region, had the lowest numbers at 317.
What about the Prairie region, please?
The Prairie region, 573. We've noted that the Prairie region has a younger population, and that's largely because of the proportion of that population who are Aboriginal, and the Aboriginal offenders are younger.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
This is Joanne Hills from Ontario region from Beaver Creek Institute. I'm interested to hear you say that the older inmates, both male and female, have lower needs. But then when you begin to define it, they clearly have increased health needs. What's the difference between the kind of needs that you're
that's a good question, yes. We use that term very specifically in risk assessment. We talk about criminogenic needs, so needs that contributed to their offense pattern. So when we talk about needs, we talk about the 7 major domains. I'll just give you a few of them. I usually end up forgetting one. Substance abuse, employment, attitudes, associates, marital family, and personal emotional.
Thank you.
So the needs, when we say that they have lower needs in those areas, those are the criminogenic areas. But they do have higher needs in health, but health needs are not criminogenic. In other words, it's rare that health needs contribute to an offense pattern.
Yes.
Great. Any additional questions or comments for Lynn? All right, hearing none, let's carry on. Thank you again, Lynn, and I think you're staying on the line in case we have some wrap-up questions near the end. And now I'd like to turn it over to Lucy from Health Services to give us a bit of an update as to what kinds of programs and services are addressing the health needs of our aging offenders. Lucy.
Hi, it's Henry D'Souza here.
I'll do the French.
Okay, welcome, Henry D'Souza. Thank you very much for being on the call.
So what I'll do is I'll actually sort of give you more of an overview in terms of where we're heading, because one of the items on our agenda as we look over the next year or two is to in fact develop a strategy to address the needs of older offenders, and I think certainly that's one of the reasons it's on your docket as well. So I'll give you some sense of how we want to begin to approach that. It's going to be a collaborative effort because I think, as Lynn's pointed out, it's not strictly about health. It's about health, but there are other components. There's accommodations as well as other aspects. Just a couple of things. Lynn's pointed out that certainly in the literature, the definition of older offenders is 50 plus, although there are a number of, I would argue there isn't consensus on that. There are some jurisdictions that have used 65, some have used even higher, and in fact some have used lower than 50%. But certainly Lynn's outlined the reasons why it's considered to be about age 50, because inmates presumably age about 10 to 15 years more, or quicker rather than the general population. One of the things we did to kind of just in snapshot way test that out was to do some file reviews, just to look at the 50 plus to see exactly from a health perspective, now I'm speaking, what we were actually seeing in terms of disability. So when we think in terms of older offenders, there are two components. One is the actual chronological age, or the age period, and the other certainly would be the level of disability, and that's sort of the approach taken in the general public as well. Simply by being older does not necessarily mean that your needs are higher, or higher to the extent that you're experiencing functional disability. So we need to sort of keep that in mind. For example, when you look at in the Canadian public, there's fairly high satisfaction with people who are well over 65 in terms of their ability to function, and their lifestyle, their health needs, etc. So we're always wanting to be looking at a combination of that. Certainly when we did a file review, we were not seeing the level of disability that one would have anticipated using an age of strictly beginning at 50. So one of the things we were doing at intake was doing a fall scale, a fall assessment using a scale called the Morse Fall Scale. And in fact, we've just changed the age limit for the use of that particular tool to 65. Because frankly, not too many people between 50 and 64 were falling. So that turned out to be a strategy where we were simply collecting data and doing assessments, and it turned out not to be valuable. We also know that as people age, the number of chronic diseases increase. And again, when we look at and again, this is only a sample, so it's not research, it's not the caliber of the work, the level of work that Lynn is talking about. We also were not seeing what we would expect in terms of levels of disability. To be sure, we did see an increase in chronic diseases, but when you look at where the older offenders are currently located, there is a fairly large number of them, a high proportion of them are actually in minimum security, which by definition suggests that they're relatively capable. And then the next group were in medium, and there were a few in maximum. Disproportionately, I think, as Lynn mentioned, it's distributed disproportionately in terms of regions. So if you're looking at 65 plus, and not to be confused with the 50 plus, in Quebec, so Quebec and Ontario combined would have roughly 58% of those who would be 65 plus, with about 30% in Quebec. Ontario, 28%, Prairie is 14%, and then Lynn mentioned that generally there are a younger population in Prairies. Pacific, 19%, and Atlantic, 9%. So we see that from a planning perspective, we need to pay a fair bit of attention to Ontario and Quebec, particularly when we start planning around accommodations and the like. In terms of how one might approach this, a couple of things. One, we took a look at a U.S. round table group that gathered in 2012, and it was a group consisting of 29 experts with experience and knowledge in geriatrics and end-of-life medicine, psychology, psychiatry. They had some civil rights folks there, legal folks, etc. And they came up with what they described as a consensus list of action items that can be used to advance policy agenda in terms of optimizing health care for older offenders. They refer to them as older prisoners. So so our approach is to kind of follow through with some of those items. Part of the strategy in terms of moving forward in this as well is we have a healthcare advisory committee, as you may know. We're refocusing that committee and bringing membership onto that committee with expertise in older offenders, so physical care from older offender from psychiatry. We're trying to get physicians from the Indigenous Physician Association of Canada to cover that piece. We'll certainly look at women, although, as Lynn pointed out, there are fewer women in the category we would consider older offenders, or at least currently. So that group then will provide of course we'll have geriatricians and so on, the oversight, the guidance. So in terms of the items identified by the consensus group, the first item they had was, of course, define the older offender, and I think Lynn has covered that, and I've offered some comments in terms of where we might go. I think from our perspective, from the health perspective, we're probably going to be focusing more towards the older end of things from a planning perspective. One, it makes the task of planning a bit easier, more realistic, particularly if we're going to be planning around the accommodations piece. To be sure, even if we use sort of 65 as a cutoff, and that's not to say that if you're 65, you're necessarily quote unquote old in the sense of any sort of functional disability. But we also have to take note of the group that Lynn talks about, the 50 plus, which is sort of the feeder group, if you will, which is much larger. So defining the population will be the first thing we'll have to look at. And within CSC, we're going to do, in addition to looking at just older offenders, we're also going to look at those who, independent of age, may have functional disabilities and plan for that group at the same time. Staff training is the other aspect that's recommended by this consensus group. And in terms of that, we are in the process of negotiating with Queen's University to develop some training related to older offenders for us. And we'll be training in sort of 3 areas or 3 different groups. The clinical staff, of course, is where the bulk of the training will be. But we also want to train or provide some training to administrative staff, people like myself and others, correctional staff as well. And so they're in the process of developing those modules for us, and then the plan is we're going to pilot those in the Kingston area to ensure that it's the kind of training that will meet our needs. Define functional impairment. That's the other category by this consensus group. And again, we're going to be looking for advice from the healthcare advisory and other expertise in the area of geriatrics and psychogeriatrics in terms of how we approach the issue of conducting functional assessments. One of the things we want to be very careful with in terms of learning from our experience is if we're going to be doing functional assessments, the questions that would arise is when do you do the functional assessment? Do you do it across the board? We don't want to do it too early, have it become a workload issue, and then the information we have is not useful. So we really want to get some expert advice on when is the right time to be doing screening assessment around functional disabilities, because that's a key piece. We already have the falls assessment piece in place. We have falls prevention program in place as well. Similarly, the other item was screening for dementia. A similar issue there in terms of there are good dementia scales, and there's sort of one or two that's considered the ones that are more widely used. But again, timing on that. Do we just start routinely screening everyone at 50? Do we wait till 65 or just 75 or some other age? Again, really trying to balance early intervention is important, but if the intervention is too early, it can also be less useful, and not only is it annoying to the patient, it's a workload to staff, and it's mounds of assessment data that's collected that's not used. So we really want to make whatever interventions we take really strategic and useful to the client. Identify needs of older women is the other item, and that's less of a challenge for us, as Lynn pointed out, because the numbers are smaller, but nevertheless, we would certainly want to be paying attention to that from the gender perspective. They had an item called Create Policies for Geriatric Housing. That's going to be a little bit different for us. We have a variety of infrastructure, some newer, some older. We have someone currently now looking at every single cell across in terms of getting a sense of what cells are able to accommodate individuals with disabilities, special needs, etc. Previously, we had done a scan of regions, and we did this one through Health Services. And in each of the regions, in each of the institutions, they identified a number of cells that were available and useful for inmates with who are older or had disabilities. Often these cells were placed closer to healthcare, or where there was more traffic, if you will, to maintain oversight with that particular group. So we are doing some work in that area. That's going to be a more challenging one for us, to the extent that if we need any infrastructure changes. We also have, in terms of accommodations, excellent infrastructure in the Pacific region in a rehab unit. It's called the ECHO unit. And they also have a fairly, I think, good model that can respond to the needs of older offenders and those with disabilities, but probably those at the much higher end, meaning more disability, needing more care. They also have a peer, what do we call them, a peer helper group that works with these older offenders. The peer group actually lives in the same living environment with this group, and they have a fairly good multidisciplinary team that includes occupational therapy and physio and mental health, etc. So we do have that as a potential. Well, it is a national resource in place. The other couple of items that this consensus group put out there were things related to release and into the community. Some of these, again, would be more specific to the U.S. But one of the things that we would do in that column, if you will, was really kind of take a closer look at our discharge planning to see whether we need to be doing something differently with respect to this group. As you may know, finding for the group with a higher need, finding openings in long-term care, et cetera, in the community is a challenge already in the community, let alone for someone coming with a correctional background. So that's something we're going to have to look at. And we have established some partnerships with that, particularly, and we have some significant ones in the Quebec region. Medical release, we already have, as part of our end-of-life care guidelines, provisions for release, early release as an alternative to incarceration. Again, the driver or the key is always, does the medical condition mediate or reduce the risk? So it's still risk-based. The decision is made by the parole board, but there is an opportunity for CSE to put forward referrals and cases, and that's something that's currently in place and has been in place for some time. Enhanced palliative care programs is the final item on the list from this consensus panel. I think we have a fairly very, very good palliative care program, or end-of-life program, as we're changing the name, already. But again, we will be taking another look at that. There's some things, for example, that we would do that we don't currently have, is perhaps make additional exceptions in the formulary, the drug formulary, to ensure that we have less restrictions on pain medication, those kinds of things. So we're currently looking at that. So that's sort of the thumbnail on it. In terms of the actual thinking of how we look at this, we think of it in terms of level of need. So if you think of most of the inmates would be in what we would call the self-care level of need, and ultimately we'll probably use some form of a frailty scale, and so we would expect most of the inmates 50 plus, 65 plus to fall into that even primary care. In other words, they're still able to go to the healthcare center, be treated for diabetes, other chronic diseases, etc. A smaller group would be sort of low to medium support, and in that instance we'd be looking at things like peer support, looking at more accessible environments that facilitates mobility, and looking at opportunities, alternative ways of encouraging and supporting exercise and diet and those kinds of things. And then finally, so if you think of this in terms of a pyramid, the bottom would be the self-care, the next piece up the pyramid would be low to medium support, and then high support would be the specialized programming. We're really kind of maximizing physical, cognitive functioning, and really trying to accommodate and address cognitive limitations. And at that point, you'll be needing 24-hour support. So that would be like the facility we have in the Pacific, for example. So there's that component. So that's sort of the mental, physical health component related to age as it relates to disability. There's an additional piece that's related to older or aging, and that's sort of the developmental aspect of aging. So even if you don't have disability or your chronic diseases are well managed, there is still the issue that comes with age, a feeling of feeling of isolation, social need for social engagement, engagement from family and friends, etc. Needing to find a meaningful work or meaningful activities that you can engage in. You may have been working within the institution and now you're unable to. Addressing spiritual needs and dealing with things like regret and guilt and fear of dying in prison, dying alone, etc. And then there is, given the environment, the whole vulnerability related to or worry about victimization. So while we're thinking of addressing the, if you will, the obvious chronic diseases and the like, we also have to do some planning around these developmental aspects related to aging. In terms of what we already have, just to give you some sense, in place, obviously, as I mentioned, we have falls assessment and fall prevention. We have palliative care and guidelines that accompany those. We have access to expertise. We bring in specialists into the institution, as many of you know. Dietary services or special diets, those are available as needed. We do have a certain percentage of cells that can accommodate wheelchairs. We have available now mobility aids, walkers, wheelchairs, even electronic wheelchairs, physiotherapy. We have done some training in the area of palliative care and older offenders, and I mentioned before we're certainly going to be taking a new approach to that and certainly refreshing and updating ourselves on that. We provide a range of vaccines, including vaccines for flu and shingles and so on. So just to give you some sense of what's there already. So in summary then, we are currently meeting the needs of older offenders on an individual basis. What we want to do is to think of this group from a population health perspective and specifically begin to design how we approach this group and more deliberately find ways to provide services to this group that will meet their needs over the long haul. Questions?
Thank you, Henry, very much. I think we'll just invite ourselves to any of those training pilots that you have going on. If there's an opportunity to invite CAC members within the Kingston region when some of those sessions are going on, it'd be fascinating if we could actually take part. So there, we'll invite ourselves to something like that.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions?
This is Hafiz Rahman again from CAC Collins Bay.
Go ahead.
If somebody needs palliative care, this person cannot be any risk to society anymore. So why do we keep him in the institution?
So the question was if someone needs palliative care and
he can't be any risk to the society anymore.
Okay.
Why do we keep them in the system?
Right. Well, a couple of things. One, the decision about who is really, there are provisions that whereby the parole officer will do an assessment and we make a referral to the parole board for release on compassionate grounds. It's not, the Act actually doesn't refer to the term compassionate grounds, but that's the one that's more easily understood. And then the parole board makes a decision. So there are instances when, in fact, an inmate would, in fact, receive a release to live out those final days in the community. But it is risk-based. So they, in fact, do look at risk. There are inmates who are palliative and whose risk continues to be very high, such that it is still a threat to the community. And in those instances, the parole board will likely say no to that.
Additional questions or comments? This is Lori. I'm wondering if I noticed in the research summary, Lynn, and then Henry, you also commented on some of these specialized housing options. And I was curious about, it seems to be an American model. What does that really look like? Are there prospects for those kinds of infrastructure changes within CSC, or do we feel that the infrastructure changes that have been made are adequate at this time?
I don't know if I can answer that question yet. I could probably give a better answer to that in a couple of months.
Okay.
Because we are currently looking at that issue. Mm-hmm. And so we need to kind of do the inventory piece first. We do have excellent opportunities in the Pacific region.
Thank you. So we'll stay tuned on that one, and then we'll come and pester you in a couple of months.
Good.
Comments or questions? How about any reflections on something that you heard today where it seems opportune for CAC to consider contributing?
Well, just to follow up on what you said earlier, this is Hafiz Rahman, CAC College Bay, about the program that's being initiated at Queen's University. We'd be interested to join in if you're invited to.
For sure. I made a note of that, and I will follow up.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for your interest. Okay, here's the last call for comments or questions. Well, hearing none, a huge thank you for Henry/Lucy, and also to Lynn. Thank you. These have been incredible sessions that certainly give us so much more to think about as CAC members about what is the current landscape, certainly for aging offenders, and now what can we do, what services are provided, et cetera, and how can we contribute to this whole initiative. So thank you very much for your time today. We will be repeating this call in French in about 10 minutes. So those of you who are bilingual or would like to have the bilingual experience, by all means, please call in. And again, thank you for your interest. Thank you to David and Suzanne and Donna at National Headquarters for arranging this call for us. Thanks to our presenters, and thanks to all of you for your interest and participation today. Have a great rest of the day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.